Hey peers, it's Mr. Wood, and I'm here to work with you on our vocab words and give you some quick definitions and examples. So take this sheet out. This would be, of course, our work packet of doom, which is 36 glorious pages long. Excuse me for 1 minute. And now, we are going to look at these vocab words that go with this glorious work packet on imperialism. So let's look at our first one, which is diplomacy. So diplomacy, if I'm looking at what diplomacy is as a definition, first off, diplomacy, here we got the Google image of pictures of diplomacy. Diplomacy pretty much is when you work with someone else and you try to discuss things like borders, resources. Think two countries or two nations talking to each other and trying to work together. Now, diplomacy is going to happen a lot between the European powers during this time period as they are gutting up and cutting up places like Africa and India. So it's kind of like they're very diplomatic with each other, a diplomat, someone who practices diplomacy. They're very diplomatic with each other as they are taking over other parts of the world, as we will discuss, trying not to get in each other's way. The Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 was very diplomatic as they were talking to each other about how to steal and loot Africa's resources. So that would be diplomacy and how we're looking at it with some historical significance during this time period. That's diplomacy, number one. Ding! Term number two, transoceanic empires. Basically what this means, you have an empire that crosses oceans. So you have an empire like we're looking at Britain, for example. Britain had an empire that went across the Atlantic Ocean, actually went across the Indian Ocean, and they took over a whole lot of land and resources from other people. So transoceanic empires would be empires that are crossing the oceans. We're thinking France, Spain, and Portugal had one in the previous era. And now that we're looking at the modern era, Britain is the biggest player in this one. But we also see like Germany, Belgium, and other people get colonies too, which are part of transoceanic empires. And there we see in these colors here, like the orangish color right there, that would be areas where Britain had colonies and was using their transoceanic empire. Sorry, I slipped up there a little bit, but I'm not going to re-record it. There you go. All right, our biggest word on here is imperialism, and this is what this chapter is all about. Imperialism is pretty much the process of empire building that we will see Europe get involved in mostly. The United States gets a little involved, and so does Japan. It is building your empire by taking over other lands for resources. Definitely the biggest example I can think of imperialism is on this one down here. We talk about Africa. How in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, when Europe basically decided how to break apart Africa, and they were imperialistic, meaning they took the resources from the people and used it for their empire. And they were diplomatic with each other. See what I did there? The first word. They were diplomatic with each other in their imperialism. Also, there was some fighting over it. China was also, if we look up here, China was also a victim of imperialism as European powers and Japan divided them up. Again, the main players in imperialism are Europe, especially Britain we're looking at here. I'm picking on them quite a bit in this chapter. The United States shows some imperialism too, especially on the Spanish-American War and the Mexican-American War a little bit. Gringos. And also we see Japan and Russia get involved in imperialism as well. All right, our word number 4 is imperialistic warfare. When I think imperialistic warfare, one thing comes to my mind during this era, and that would be the Maxim gun. As you know, many times was said during this time period, Europeans said, I believe it was the British, that we have the Maxim gun and they don't when all else fails. Here we see some examples of how this gun was used in Africa. Again, as we talked about, the Maxim gun made it much more possible for imperialistic activity, imperialistic warfare to happen where Europeans were able to dominate. It's definitely the reason why the Boer War happened and why the Boers were able to defeat the Zulu, for example. It's also why the Belgians are able to do so much in the Congo. I mean, having the Maxim gun helps. It's not the only reason, but it's a pretty big reason. When you have a gun that fires automatic shots, it's basically, you know, the precursor of the machine gun. You can see why other people would not be able to defeat this thing. We'll see what happens to the Maxim gun when we get to World War I, where it changes up a little bit. But that's imperialistic warfare, and usually mean that there's better technology the Europeans, Japanese, Americans had, and so they were able to take over other people in Africa, Asia, India, as we'll look at in our packet. Next word. Our next word is settler colony. Now, settler colony is where you would find in areas like Europeans, when they had taken over a land, and they started their colonies with their people living there. So a lot of times Europeans in this era living in other parts of Africa and India. There were definitely settler colonies in India. Definitely settler colonies in South Africa. In South Africa, there was definitely like more racial lines rigidly drawn in the settler colonies where whites and blacks did not mix. In India, it wasn't quite that way. There were actually British guys who married local Indian women. But what a settler colony pretty much was is an area of the conquerors who came in and started their own colony, had their own schools, and they separated themselves from the native people who lived there. So that is pretty much what a settler colony is. All right, our next word is economic imperialism. Economic imperialism is pretty much when one country dominates another economically. What does that mean? Economics, if we look at this chart here, has to do a lot with resources and use of resources. So economic imperialism is basically when one country is able to come in and take away resources from another, or at least dominate them. We saw a lot of this in mercantilism in the last chapter where, you know, like you would take all the goods from that country, make the finished product, and then sell them back to them. This happens a lot with imperialism during this era as well, where natural resources are gutted out of places like Africa, India, and makes the imperial powers like the Britons of the world, again, picking on the British a lot, but also like, you know, the French, the Germans, the Americans, by that I mean Americans, and other imperialistic powers like Japan even, they start to dominate other areas economically. All right, our next term on your sheet is social Darwinism, and this is one of these ones that just make me sick. Social Darwinism is this belief that evolution happens socially, and especially Europeans at this time believed in social Darwinism, that people of European ancestry were somehow more evolved, and there was survival of the fittest, and the warfare and things that were going on during this age of imperialism should go on because it was Europe should dominate the world because they are a more evolved people and should dominate over other people. It's sick. Here we see, a picture from someone who believed in social Darwinism of the Anglo, or, the white dude, in the center there being like more advanced than Irish Iberian. Remember, Irish Iberian is really an interesting term because, remember I was telling you about this, like as we review white people today, if you go back a couple hundred years ago, even 100, 150 years ago, many Irish people weren't considered white because they weren't considered as high as other Europeans like the English. And there we see the one that says Negro, and that would be like at this time social Darwinism would have taught you that Africans were lower on the scale than people of European ancestry. Extremely racist. And that's what it is, and that was justified a lot of the imperialistic actions that happened during this time period. Our next term is possibly even worse than social Darwinism. It's called White Man's Burden. This was a poem by Kipling that was a parody. It was actually ripping on America when we were in the Spanish-American War. White Man's Burden was this belief that, satire that white people felt like they had the need to advance other people of other societies. So here you see Uncle Sam, for example, carrying very, very, very racist caricatures of other people from Cuba, Africa, and other places, and they had to carry them up to civilization. Which is ironic, because if we studied in AP, we know that Europeans took a long-ass time to become civilized themselves and were way behind for most of world history. But it was the belief that, Europeans, we had nicer tools and technology, so therefore we must be more advanced, and that we need to carry other people to civilization. I think I'm going to go puke now. Oh God, it just keeps getting worse. Now we're on King Leopold. Okay, so King Leopold, this guy was a King of Belgium in our era of imperialism, and basically he started an empire in the Belgian Congo, was able to take a lot of the resources, especially like rubber from the Africans, was able to go in with his army, enslave people from Belgium to work for him to get ivory resources, other resources like rubber. Some of the tactics he would use would be like kidnapping the women and then making the men work by threatening them. They would cut off people's hands if they weren't getting enough resources, whippings. And this was done in the Congo, which is a huge section of Africa. And again, one of the biggest reasons why it was possible was the technological differences, the Maxim gun, and other resources like that. I have a brilliant but hard book to read called King Leopold's Ghost if anyone wants to have that. But know that King Leopold was involved in imperialism from Belgium, taking over the Congo, a huge section of Africa, which kind of became his own private kingdom where he profited off and made a huge amount of money off it on the slavery of the African people who were basically in slavery. And you can see there's hands cut off and different things in this picture. We'll learn more about this as we go, but that's who King Leopold was. Next here we have Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was is known as the founder of the De Beers Diamond Company. He went into South Africa and wanted to build a huge international train all the way from South Africa, as we see down here, all the way to Egypt up here. And again, extracted diamonds. Was someone who said that they were going to do this for the good of the African people, but again, it became blatantly about getting money and riches for himself and his associates. Again, associated with taking out diamonds, other resources out of Africa during the scramble of Africa in our age of imperialism. The Sepoy Rebellion, or Mutiny, it happened in 1857. This was in a rebellion where soldiers who were Indian, who were fighting in the British Army, because the British allowed Indians to come in, quite a few of them, to come into their military, had a rebellion. You will learn more about it. I'll give you the quick vocab definition. What basically happened was the British had cartridges that were rumored to, they may have not, have had fat that was from both cows and pigs in them, which offended both Hindus and Muslims, and they were supposed to chew them off and put them into their muskets as they loaded them. And this is kind of a final straw that a lot of Indians had against the cultural imperialism that Britain was doing to them. And they had a huge rebellion that lasted a long time. Lots of people died. And it was pretty much the end of the British East Indian Company. And then Britain came in formally as a government and took over in India. We'll get more details on that, though. All right, the Opium War. The Opium War was a war between Britain and China. There were actually two wars. These were fought over the opium trade. Britain wanted to trade with China, but the only thing they could really get them to trade for was silver. And Britain had a tough time getting silver, so they found a way to smuggle in opium and trade with the Chinese. And there were, admittedly, Chinese traders who were willing to engage in this trade with Britain, and it brought opium in, which then they were able to use to get a favorable balance of trade or to get more goods from China. This opium they grew in India, and they brought to China, and they brought in, which caused a huge opium crisis and addiction in China, which China said no to, and then Britain said, no, that's not going to be okay, and invaded them and fought them. Actually, China dumped out the opium that came in one day, and Britain won the war and was able to get China to pay for the opium they dumped and kept coming in. And this is how, which led to China being invaded by more imperialistic powers, Britain, and other countries, and we'll get to more of that later. The Monroe Doctrine. This was a doctrine, I'll give you the real simple thing by President Monroe, that basically stated that the Western Hemisphere, or the Americas, was the United States' sphere of influence, and that Europe should stay out of that area. That was America's influence. And basically how this affects us in the age of imperialism is that the United States will become a lot more involved in places like Cuba, Costa Rica, as we talked about in the industrial age, and other areas in the Americas, which will continue in the modern period and the contemporary period as well. The Boer Wars. These were wars between Dutch settlers who called themselves Boers, who were living in South Africa, and the British who took control of South Africa. Britain thought they were going to come in and kick their ass, and it ended up being like a really violent, bloody war, concentration camps, and other horrible things. And they were fighting there, but no one really, consulted the Africans if they were okay with either of these groups being in their land and taking it. And it's basically two imperialistic powers, the Boers who were in there, and the British who came in, and them fighting over land in South Africa.